the mid-9th century, the two great nations of Scotland united under one ruler. So began a monarchy that survived more than 800 years, the Kingdom of the Scots.
Scotland, a hybrid word whose first syllable is of unknown derivation, but comes to us from speakers of a Celtic tongue, and whose second syllable is an English word. Altogether, it's not a bad summary of this programme about the appearance of a Celtic kingdom which extended itself to control an English province, and changed from being a group of provinces held together uncertainly by the most merciful of the provincial kings, to being a single ruling kingship, supported by resources in both men and money. It's not an easy story to tell, because our sources are so few, so brief, and so distant, as to say they were all written in Ireland or England. Time and again, the only available explanation for some barely known event is a guess or a complex assessment of a fragment or two of evidence. So you'll get some unanswered questions and some guesses. Go back to the time of the English historian Bede, who wrote in about 730 of the warlike Picts, who lived in most of the land north of the Forth, and were Christianized from Iona, the great monastery of St. Columba, in the peripheral Irish colony of Scots in Britain, which was separated from the Picts by the mountain ridge known as Dromalban. Those Picts have left traces in place names of their language, as you can see from this map. It belongs to the same Celtic family as Welsh, hence the Aber names of Scotland. Aber means the confluence or mouth of a river, as in Aberdeen, or a tiny place I'll come to soon, Aberlemno. The place name element we all use to illustrate the Picts is pit, as in Pitlochry, whose meaning is explained by the cognate English word bit and peace. The Pit names are found just where Bede implies the Picts lived. The second relic of this enigmatic people are the vivid carvings of the so-called symbol stones. This one is from Aberlemno. The symbols themselves are a cause of unending debate. We don't know what they mean, but the accompanying scenes of hunting or a great battle are surely the equivalent of the heroic poetry of the Anglo-Saxons, the Pictish record of the same aristocratic pursuits of hunting, fighting to the death in loyalty to a lord, and hard drinking. And on the other side of life, a different claim, the cross of Christ. It's unlikely that the ethos and lifestyle of the Scots in Argyll was significantly different, although they were producing sculpture equally or more remarkable, even if to our eyes it is more conventional because wholly Christian. The distinction between Scots and Picts is a real one because the former spoke Irish, a Celtic language, of a different group from Welsh or Pictish. But it also seems real because we know the names of two lines of kings, those of the Scots and those of the Picts. And this conjures up a simple picture of two kingdoms corresponding to two peoples. Almost certainly those two king lists are a gross oversimplification of political reality, for the Picts inhabited districts with distinct names which had their own rulers, whom the Irish would call by their word for king. The political reality was the province and its ruler, because the province was the area within which one man and his retinue could keep some kind of peace, repress feuding by personal effort. Certainly one man could not do this throughout the Pictish regions. The home of a provincial ruler was probably a dún, a promontory or hilltop like this one at Dundurn, in the very heart of Scotland, but overlooking a route for the Scots to enter Pictland. Here, the ramparts were built with stone brought from 15 kilometers away, and with timber and wattle supports, the whole demanding great manpower resources to toil up this steep hill with stone and timber, and to dig the earth and stone from the ditches. When one of these provincial kings subdued others and became over-king, he created the appearance of a single Pictish kingdom. But what did it amount to in practice? Governments, courts, taxes, these didn't exist except in a primitive provincial context. Royal power was precarious and dependent on success in battle which brought riches to the king and his followers. Failure meant no more plunder or rewards in land, and consequently desertion by the followers. But success could consolidate success and build towards permanence. what can be called, too simply I think, a united Pictish kingdom. And by 800, this process was well underway. To the Pictish kings extending their rule, another province to subdue was the Scots. These were the inhabitants of a relatively weak province in the west, made weaker still from 794 onwards when they came under attack from the north and west by Scandinavian raiders known as Vikings. The kingdom of the Scots seemed likely to be divided up between these two forces, but in the event, the fortunes of the Scots were reversed in a most surprising manner. What appears to have happened was this. In 839, the Pictish king was killed by the Vikings and his hegemony broken up in civil war. Among the Scots, Kenneth, son of Alpin, made himself king, and with his Scots destroyed, probably piecemeal, the rival Pictish kings. By 850, he was king of the Picts and ruler of all northern peoples. You might call Kenneth first king of a united Scotland, but he wasn't that, for his rule stopped at the Forth. You might say he united the Picts and the Scots, but what does that mean? He took tribute from them both. He led them into raids on the English. But the idea that he made them conscious of unity is absurdly anachronistic. He was called King of Picts because his wealth in men and tribute came mainly from the Picts. The islands of his former Scottish kingdom were being raided and settled by the Vikings. With the political mastery of the Scots came one of those instances of apparent submergence of a people, the Picts. The disappearance of the Pictish language is almost total disappearance, and its replacement by a form of Irish we can call Gaelic does not have to mean a mass migration of Scots among the Picts, but only a migration of farmers and landlords. I do not think we know why or how such a language change takes place, but the place names beginning with the Pictish element pit seem to belong to the time and process of change. For in the great majority of cases, the second part of each pit name is a Gaelic word, or words, as in Pitlochry, where Lochry, the king's stone, is Gaelic. It looks as though Pictish pit remained in use as Gaelic speech spread, but how long it all took before Gaelic was general in the 11th century, we do not know. I do wonder if we've not been led by the language change to overestimate the importance of a single kingship over Picts and Scots. For convenience at this stage, let's call it a Scottish kingdom. Though it's far from clear that this Scottish kingdom in the Pictish regions had a significantly different kind of kingship. The surprising, the important change in the 9th and 10th centuries was not the so-called unification of Picts and Scots, an inaccurate phrase which I think reflects the 19th century wish for an inevitable historical progression towards the union of England and Scotland in 1707. It was the successful aggression of the Scottish kings in extending their rule in a new direction, southward across a great geographical barrier where the island of Britain is so narrow that it can most naturally be divided in two. Hence, the Firth of Forth, the Scot Water or Scottish Sea as it was once called, probes deep into the landmass, where it becomes a broad moss, as we can see from this view near Stirling, an impassable bog until modern times. Few invaders of Scotland passed beyond this barrier unless they captured the one crossing point of Stirling, and it formed a natural frontier between peoples, Picts or now Scots to the north, Britons and Angles to the south. Ask Kenneth MacAlpin where England stretched to, and he would have pointed to Edinburgh or Stirling. Yet 200 years later, his successor would have pointed at the Tweed with a hungry glance at the Tyne, for the hybrid Scottish kingdom, lacking geographical or ethnic unity, had already come into being. Britain was not to be two countries and cultures, one English England, one Gaelic Scotland, divided at the Forth, but two countries, each English, each with a dissident Celtic culture. The Gaels in Scotland, the Welsh under English rule, and perhaps each the richer in culture for that diversity. That came about because Viking settlers at York destroyed the ancient kingdom of Northumbria, leaving a diminished earldom of Northumbria north of the Tees, and a problem for Anglo-Saxon kings in the south how to eliminate the Norse rulers. They needed allies, and they found them among the kings of Scots. In return for a bit of Lothian, or all of Lothian, or a bit of Cumbria, the Scottish kings were induced to call out the host in support of the Anglo-Saxon king. In effect, the English kings were giving away what was not theirs and getting little in return. By 1018, it was pretty clear that they had lost all chance of ruling beyond the Tweed. This was Lothian, not yet Scotland, but it was the land of the King of Scots. Of course, there was no reason why he should rule the northern English only to the Tweed. Why not to the Tyne or the Tees or the Humber? And throughout the 11th century, the Scottish kings harboured such hopes, bringing their wild followers across the Tweed to plunder and kill in northern England, though without adding an inch of Northumberland permanently to the kingdom. So slim are our sources that we know of these kings almost solely as war leaders. It's true that they come from one kingly family, but its various branches provided rivals for the throne in plenty in the 10th century. And very probably each rival drew his army from the province of which he was Great Steward, or Mormaer in Gaelic. Thus, a King Douv, who was killed in 966, had perhaps been governor of Fife, for the medieval earls of Fife called themselves the kin of Macduff, the son of Douv. That's the remote historical basis for Shakespeare's Macduff. I'm afraid historians do not thank Shakespeare for his version of 11th century Scotland, Macbeth. Almost everything in that play is total fiction, taken over wholesale by Shakespeare from a work by a lying university principal who wrote it in the 1520s to flatter the Scottish king and his nobility with a highly rhetorical supposed history, some of which surfaces even today, though it ought to be forgotten every single page. The truth we know is a teaspoonful compared with Shakespeare's bucket. But it does suggest that the 11th century shows a political advance on the 10th century in that kingship was relatively stable. Only Duncan had a short and unsuccessful reign after his grandfather, Malcolm II, had wiped out all potential rivals in the royal family in a long and successful reign. Duncan was killed in battle by a non-royal Macbeth, who seized the throne. And although Malcolm II, Macbeth, and Malcolm Canmore, his successor, won their thrones by killing their predecessors in battle, quite clearly they sat more securely upon the throne than did most 10th century kings. Thus, like Canute and Conrad I, other ruthless European rulers, Macbeth went in piety to Rome for pardon for his killings. When he came back after many months, he was still King of Scots, a remarkable tribute to his grip upon power. But then, when in Rome, he scattered money like seed, we are told. So he had the means of filling his purse. A government's grip, and that means a king's grip, requires one thing: sound and plentiful resources. How the Scottish king maintained these, we can only guess at. The provinces were ruled by mormaers, the equivalent of earls, each with his estates. It may be that this was the patronage through which the king ruled, appointing mormaers, requiring the more distant ones to send him tribute, circulating among those in the eastern lowlands where the greatest wealth was. Provincial rivalries persisted. Mormaers rebelled, though only Macbeth seized the throne. But from the time of Malcolm II, who died in 1034, kings were generally the masters in their kingdom, perhaps because the ruthless Malcolm, in punishing the disloyal, acquired much property to reward the loyal. Property meant land, and land meant two things: army service and rent. In a word, resources. Let's take army service first. To do this, we have to look at what fragmentary evidence there is. Go back to King Douv, whose death in battle in 966 is, I think, commemorated on this remarkable 20-foot-high monument called Sweno's Stone, which stands by the road from Forres to Kinloss. It's now badly eroded, as you can see. Here, on one side, there marches a great army on horseback. Below, a central figure with a helmet and quilted coat, Douv, I suggest, watches with his armed retinue while the armies begin to fight on foot. In the next panel, the bodies and severed heads of the dead lie about, watched over by a church bell and 4 men with staffs, maybe the clergy, while 2 couples fight and 4 men wait to advance with sword and shield. Below that, an army of 8 with swords and shields see off 6 of the enemy fleeing on horseback. But the battle continues with 3 fighting couples on each side of an arc, the bridge of Kinloss, covering dead bodies and heads. One of the heads, that of Douve, framed to stress its importance. We know from a chronicle that Douve was killed in a battle at Forres, and that his body lay under the bridge of Kinloss. At the very bottom, the fight continues, but with one man defending the departure of others. And on the other side, below the great cross, a badly eroded scene with 4 figures bending over a central one, which may represent the burial of Douve's body in or near this very spot. The artist has depicted as faithfully as the Bayeux tapestry does later something of contemporary society. The warriors are simply equipped with sword or spear, the retinue with both, and round shield, and unbelted leather coats by way of armour, and are indistinct except in the bottom line where the heads clearly wear helmets of some kind. Some are mounted, a wealthier class, but the fighting is always on foot. The technology of war is faithfully reproduced here, but so too are the ranks of society and their obligation to fight for a leader. Now, army service of this kind is one side of a relationship which was widespread in European society. It was owed by those who possessed land, and it was owed by them in some kind of proportionality to the land. In other words, these headless corpses represent the farmers or peasants whose labours produced the wealth to support their lords, on horseback here, and ultimately to support the king. So the other side of the relationship is rent. Those who laboured on the estates of great lords, like provincial rulers, abbots, bishops, produced rent in meal, honey, and cheese, some of which was paid over to maintain the lord in his hall, doubtless in the same proportions as the military service owed. The point I seek to make is that there was a rural economy, a struggle to produce food and to maintain the non-producers, the lordly ones riding on their steeds across Sweno's stone. With the wealth which they creamed off the rest of society, the greater landowners doubtless commissioned the commemorative stones which continue the Pictish tradition of carving, but with declining assurance and skill. These and a very few hoards of buried coins are the only material evidence we have that they were possessed of wealth, for no one has identified the homes, halls, and storehouses of the men of 1000 AD. The contrast between England and Scotland in these centuries is a stark one. The English king ruling a country whose vast wealth and developed economy are dramatically illustrated by the huge quantities of coin handed over to the new Danish attackers, Sweyn and Canute. Scotland with no native coinage and precious little evidence that foreign coins were much used. On the one hand, there is good evidence of estates comprehending villages and hamlets with ancient names and paying tribute or rent according to long established formulae. Moreover, our pit names must in many cases represent new settlements, new ploughing, new production, the beginnings of an increase in population and a more buoyant economy. Yet on the other hand, there is not a trace of the town life which archaeologists have been busy uncovering at Winchester, York and Dublin. So far as we know, Scotland lacked the commerce and industry which go along with money as a means of exchange. But the beginnings of commerce were surely there. We just haven't looked long enough or hard enough for them. Let me take just one pointer. The name of Berwick shows that it was once a distant outlying village belonging to some estate, perhaps the estate of Coldingham. But about 1100, the king took it over, and 25 years or so later, he put a sheriff there, an official who elsewhere handled the meal, honey and cheese of the king's income and managed the king's hall or castle for his visits. But at Berwick, these arrangements did not obtain, and it seems that the sheriff sold the produce to put cash in the king's pocket and managed a money economy in what was now a growing town. This market economy must surely have developed over decades and perhaps a century, going back into the time of Macbeth, time for which we have with no records except the remark that in Rome he scattered money like seed. With money, a king could govern. But what I said earlier remains true. The economy of Scotland and of the government of Scotland were backward indeed when compared with those of England. And so too was the intellectual climate as represented by the church. There's nothing more difficult to assess than learning and devotion. for it's human nature that each generation is well satisfied with its own attainment. But we can make a simple comparison between two books. These Gospels were probably written at Iona about 750 and are one of the greatest examples of manuscript art for all time. They are not much later than the time of an abbot who was widely read in the Christian literature which must have been available at Iona. The church among the Scots at this time was surely in some sense alive to its mission. And here, by contrast, is another text of the Gospels, written about 1000 in Aberdeenshire, crudely debased in decoration, the text so garbled as to be useless, but the manuscript itself valuable evidence in one respect. The Gospel of St. John was well known for its curative powers, and in this manuscript it is so worn that it must have been used often in efforts to heal the sick. This aspect of Christianity was important to a society with no knowledge of medicine or even hygiene. The New Testament tells of and leads us to expect miraculous cures. For a fever, suck a stone washed in a well, now called after a saint, but perhaps working cures long before Christ. Wrap a broken limb in a cloth which has touched the bone of a martyr. Lay St. John's Gospel upon an inflammation. Christianity of this kind readily complements warfare and feud as found in Old Testament Judea or Kenneth MacAlpin's Scotland. So the Pictish kings sought the powers of the Apostle Andrew, now accessible when some of his bones were brought to a Fife harbour, St. Andrews. Kenneth MacAlpin brought relics and the powers of Columba from Iona to a new cult centre at Dunkeld. Their humbler subjects drank prayerfully at wells and sucked stones. Sometimes they wanted success, but most often they sought therapy. That was the foundation of their religious life. There is little sign that lay devotion helped to build either churches or church organization. One of two church towers seem to come from this period and show that there was some life at monasteries like Brechin or Abernethy. Interestingly, the round towers show continuing contact with the Irish church, though what other forms it took, we don't know. Earlier, I spoke about the development of boundaries within which one line of kings reigned and latterly ruled. These boundaries were created by their efforts, and their subjects belonged to ethnically disparate peoples, speaking 2 or 3 very different languages. About 1125, the sons of Malcolm Canmore spoke of their subjects as English and Scots, or French, English, Scots and Galwegians. The land of Lothian was still culturally and even politically distinct from the land across the Scottish Sea, and even more distinctive through its close links with Ireland was the land of Galloway. When the unity of Scotland came later through prosperity and firm government, the sense of being one people was buttressed by a mythical history in which the church and its saints played a powerful part. The disciple Andrew became the patron saint. Andrew, be a leader to us Scottish fellow countrymen, said the seal which the Scots had made for themselves in 1286. But in 1100, the French, English, Scots and Galwegians showed little or no sign of this sense of community or nationhood.
The next program examines popular myths about the Dark Ages in the light of what we now know.